Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.
Lobbying is as old as politics itself, and Brussels, as the de facto capital of the EU, is a hotspot for lobbyists. But while this can be mutually beneficial for both industry and policymakers, there are risks, especially when public sector officials move to the private sector. So, how do EU institutions deal with the revolving doors phenomenon? Stay with us.
Interactions between the private and public sectors are a legitimate part of our democracies, and one that's certainly on the rise. They ensure that laws are not produced in disconnection from reality, but take into account the needs and often the wishes of the sector concerned.
But it's a delicate balance, as this usually mutually beneficial practice can quickly turn into biased legislation or even corruption, threatening the integrity and independence of policymaking.
Now, deeply entwined with, some would call it, the art of lobbying, is the notion of revolving doors in the EU. This concept refers to the potential conflicts of interest that can arise when individuals, be they staff, managers or political leaders, take up a new job after having worked for an EU institution.
When they move, they carry with them insider know-how, a valuable network of contacts, and a reputation that can open many doors. And while this can allow for better informed policymaking, there is a real threat of creating an unfair playing field. So, how does the EU regulate it?
Well, while there is a clear need for regulation, this should not prevent those who have been employed in EU institutions to pursue a career outside of them. That's why all EU institutions have foreseen cooling-off periods in their internal rules and codes of conduct.
These apply differently to general staff and to those in positions of membership or leadership, and the length of the cooling-off period varies widely between the EU institutions.
It does, ranging from 6 months for former MEPs and members of high-level ECB bodies to 2 years for European commissioners and 3 for the Commission President, as well as for judges or advocates general of the European Court of Justice.
More specifically, on the members of the European Parliament, it's worth noting that in the vast majority of EU countries, 20 of the 27, members of national parliaments do not need to observe a cooling-off period before moving to the private sector.
Now, apart from the cooling-off periods, there are also ethical rules to be respected by members of the EU institutions. And while these normally include the duty of integrity, loyalty, independence, impartiality, or a mix thereof, the codes of conduct of the members of high-level ECB bodies and of the European Court of Auditors add a further nuance, whereby even the appearance of infringing one of those duties must be avoided.
But despite the rules in place, revolving doors is becoming an increasingly significant issue in Brussels. We spoke to Koen Rovers, Inquiries Officer at the European Ombudsman Office, with a large experience with revolving doors cases, including a broad investigation into how the European Commission deals with this issue.
The European Ombudsman has put a lot of emphasis on raising awareness about revolving doors because of their potential to damage the integrity of the EU administration if not properly managed. Based on our inquiries in this area, we believe that any new job for an EU staff member in the private sector should only be authorized where there is either no risk of conflict of interest or if this risk can be mitigated. The Ombudsman has also said that more transparency in how the EU administration handles revolving door requests would help the public better scrutinize these decisions and increase citizens' trust in the EU institutions.
As the EU Transparency Watchdog, the European Ombudsman has examined several cases of revolving doors. One of the most notorious concerned José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission, who joined Goldman Sachs in a senior advisory position immediately after the end of his cooling-off period.
This and many other cases were denounced by transparency watchdogs, the press and also politicians, arguing that these situations undermined the integrity of EU institutions and undermined trust in them even if the cooling-off periods were respected. We spoke to Vicky Can, researcher at Corporate European Observatory.
10 years ago, Corporate Europe Observatory did a report which looked at the former commissioners leaving office, and we found that 9 out of the 26 were going through the revolving door into roles with corporations or with other organizations with links to big business. And I think this leads to public trust concerns about how close the EU's executive is to private interests. 10 years on, I think there is still a major revolving door problem within the EU institutions. We need tougher rules to try and clamp down on this problem, but we also need a better culture in the Brussels bubble, which sees the revolving door and conflicts of interest as totally unacceptable.
At international level, several organizations, such as the OECD and the Council of Europe, have come up with their own guidelines and recommendations to ensure the transparency and integrity of lobbying activities.
But often the issue is not the lack of appropriate ethical rules, but the lack of proper implementation of those rules. In particular, the European Ombudsman has drawn attention to the need to customize decisions on approval of post-term activities, recommending conditional approvals or restrictions attached to post-term occupational approvals.
So what's the way forward? Here's Silvia Kotanidis from the European Parliamentary Research Service.
Parliament realized that revolving doors were a problem. That's why in 2023 it introduced a 6-month cooling-off period. But this might not have been enough. That's why other measures were introduced to preserve the integrity of the legislative process. For example, now rapporteurs or shadow rapporteurs must submit a declaration of awareness of the existence of a conflict of interest, and they must also list the entities or persons from whom they received input in the report.
Want to know more? Check out the full in-depth analysis by Silvia Kotanidis on the EPRS website or in our app.
This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.
Thanks for listening.